Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm super excited to have Dr. Julie Schell with us today. Julie is Assistant Dean for Instructional Continuity and Innovation and Executive Director of Executive and Extended Education and Assistant Professor of Practice for On-Ramps. And I'm super excited because we're going to be talking about a subject that is near and dear to my heart, which is learning in general and organizational learning. Julie, we went through this, so you know the rigmarole on this. We're going to start, but just for people who haven't seen this yet, and we probably have some new viewers, we start with the same three questions we do for everybody, and we end with the same three questions for everybody. And then in between, we have a specific subject that we are going to talk about. And in this case, it's organizational learning and learning concepts in general. Again, super excited to have you, Julie. So first question, in 2 minutes or less, tell us your career story. How did you get to where you are professionally today?
Well, hello everyone. I am excited to be here, and just a slight correction there. No longer with on ramps, but I'm going to get to that towards the end, actually. So,
Okay.
thank you so much for having me. Learning is anyone who knows me. If you ask them what's Julie about, they will say learning. So I'm really excited to be here. Thank you for having me, and hello everyone. So my career story, ever since I was a child, I wanted to be a teacher. When I was really young, I used to wake up on Saturday mornings, and I was an '80s kid, so usually kids would be watching the Smurfs, and I would actually go into the family room and set up a little desk and set up a couple of sheets of paper, and then I would very carefully write out math problems. And then when my little brother would wake up, I would stop him from going to watch TV and force him to sit and math problems, and then I would correct them. And I think that probably explained our strained relationship for most of life. But so I always wanted to be a teacher, and I used to think as I moved throughout schooling that teaching was really broken. So I went to graduate school at the best teachers college I could possibly find to study teaching and work on improving it, and I did a dissertation on teaching improvement. And in the process, I realized that teaching actually wasn't broken, but learning was. And since then, I've been on an absolute relentless pursuit to try to help people improve their ability to learn, which landed me at a postdoc with a learning savant at Harvard, and then my obsession with learning brought me here to UT. And I'm here and working on this because the way the majority of people learn is really broken, which is shocking because uh, we spend more than 10,000 hours in compulsory schooling, and then if we go into higher ed, it's more like 20,000 hours where we're forced to learn, but most humans don't learn effectively. So that's what I'm about, and that's how I got here.
That is really exciting. As I say, this is a really important subject for me, and especially as it relates to leadership. So we're going to have half an hour is not enough, but we'll see what we can do. Leadership. What does leadership mean to you?
So it's probably no surprise, but to me, leadership means always learning. And I think that learning is actually something that we crave as humans. If you read about learning, especially around sort of business leadership, learning is something that it's a drive. It's sort of an innate need. On the Maslowian hierarchy, even we have this sort of innate drive, and from the time we're born, we are active learners. We are picking up things, we're listening to sounds and learning our parents' voice. We're making tons of mistakes, we're breaking stuff, we're getting lost, we're burning our hands on stoves, and that's how we become a human being. Learning is how we become human. Um, and we're wired to learn from this sort of evolutionary perspective, but somewhere along the way, as we move into adolescence, that innate that innate crave for learning sort of gets stripped out of us. And so to me, leadership means carving paths to allow people to get back to that hardwired place of being able to explore and discover, break things, make mistakes, and evolve. And one thing that I think that people really misunderstand about learning is that they think it's supposed to be fun and that it's supposed to feel good. But the truth about learning is it can be really painful,
Mhm.
especially if it's deep and meaningful learning.
Yeah, and I think another thing that happens, sort of a misunderstanding with some leaders, is that when you are nurturing that learning as a leader, it's not it's not prescriptive. Like it's important to understand that it's more about promoting it and allowing people to explore.
Yes. And it also, I think, one mistake leaders make is that they think learning happens really fast.
Mhm.
And especially if it's something complex. And if you're a fast learner, and you're an expert, you have mastery over a topic, you're going to learn things much more quickly than if it's a new topic for one of your staff. And so, yeah, that's a leadership mistake is to think learning is supposed to feel good and also to think it happens really fast and that it's easy. It's actually really, really difficult.
Right, and it's not compulsory. It's not just compliance. It's not. So if you're learning something about diversity, equity, and inclusion, it's not something you check off the list. It's ongoing. It's a
Right.
long haul.
Yeah, and I think there's a difference between training and learning in that respect.
Yes. Don't get me started. Okay, so this is the last standard question. What do you suspect or know bothers people about you as a leader? Or similarly, but not the same question, what is your leadership weakness?
I mean, definitely lots of things probably. The story I told about my brother, that it can be kind of annoying where when I get into that sort of teacher mode. But I think I'm not sure people would use this phrase, but my self-awareness exercises are that I'm extremely optimistic, and that can be both a positive and a negative. I operate at a 50,000-foot view, which means I have 50,000-foot expectations, so very, very high expectations for myself and my team. And that also means that I firmly believe that we and myself, and I put this on myself, probably more than anyone else, can achieve near impossible things or extremely ambitious things in the service of the vision. And so workflow can be affected by
Right.
overvision and extreme optimism.
Hmm. Okay, good, good. Let's get into the broad overview before we delve into kind of leadership's role with learning and learning organizations. Let's kind of get some context here. What define a learning organization for us?
Sure. So the sort of textbook definition of a learning organization is that it has two parts. And even though it's textbook, I actually really like it because it's the same as what we do as humans when we're learning. So a learning organization it's aligned with how we learn as humans. And so there's two parts to a learning organization. And the first part is that it's an organization that constantly creates or constructs knowledge. And that knowledge can be about itself, about the organization itself, about its people, about its products, or the topic or subject that it works on. Or it can be if we're growing within the organization, or it can be for outside the organization. So if you're a knowledge organization and you're creating knowledge or to transfer outside of the organization, that's part of a learning organization too. But really, it's this first layer. This first part of a learning organization is that they constantly create or construct new knowledge. The second part is that they then make use of that knowledge to to grow, to innovate, to succeed, to evolve, to change the world. And those two components are really important. And sometimes we have organizations that are really good at one but not good at the other. So you can think of an organization that creates a lot of knowledge about things they need to do differently, but then can't
They
execute.
don't apply it. Mhm.
So those are the two components of a learning organization.
That's really interesting. I hadn't really understood that, and that makes sense. I think people can go through the motions of acquiring knowledge, but then they don't actually digest it and apply it in a way that's productive. That's great. So you study learning and you teach learning. how do the concepts of learning apply to developing a learning organization?
I think the most important thing right now is having self-regulated learners. And so a self-regulated learner is sort of the holy grail of learners, someone who understands what they need to learn, and drives their own learning, moves asks the questions that they need to ask to push their learning forward, and develop self-awareness. So a self-regulated learner, the sort of core component of a self-regulated learner is that they work to understand what they know and what they don't know, which in the learning science world is called, metacognition, thinking about your thinking, thinking about your knowing, and really developing a sense of awareness about what you know and what you don't know, and calibrating on that. And so a learning organization has to have self-regulated learners. In fact, I think that whether you're in higher ed or you're in corporate America, the ability to learn and to have self-regulated learning as a feature is the differentiator. There are lots of different things that organizations can do to succeed. They can copy processes and products from other organizations. They can look for models, but really to excel and succeed and to be competitive, you have to have the most robust approach to self-regulated learning, compared to your peers. And so that's what I would say is the most important concept right now, is to have self-regulated learners,
Mm-hmm.
especially in where we're at in the face of so much uncertainty and ambiguity.
Right. Yeah. It's different times.
Yes.
Okay. So UT is an institution of higher, pretty well respected institution of higher education. Are all institutions of higher ed by default learning organizations?
Yeah, so I think there's probably a continuum, and there's multi-dimensional aspects to learning organizations. And so I think we're definitely, institutions of higher education exist to create and construct knowledge. And
Mhm.
so we definitely have that component. And we also are really good at transferring that knowledge outside to the world through research and publication. So from the core mission of the university, I would say yes. But when we start to look at organizations and units and administration within the university, I think there are pockets where we're really great at this first part, which is understanding what needs to be done differently, but infrastructure and systems sort of lacking in order to execute on the new knowledge that we develop. And that's part of a university, is one of the things that makes it different than corporate America. An organization, learning organization, Amazon, Google, those are precedent learning organizations. In higher ed, we're very constrained. We have very limited resources. We have limited physical space. We have to be very, we have severe budget constraints, and so that makes it difficult to execute on some of the things we know need to be done differently.
Right. Okay. Yeah, I think that the concern is that we're so focused on researchers and students that sometimes the people who are helping to make the university run, we don't realize that those people also need to always be learning. And it is a heavy lift, but it doesn't have to be expensive either.
Right.
So, if you were charged with establishing or developing a learning organization, uh, how would you do it? What would your approach be?
So there's a professor at Harvard Business School that talks about the building blocks of learning organizations, and I really admire him. And he talks about these sort of three building blocks. The first is making sure that there's an environment or a climate of learnability. He uses a little bit different phrasing. So, he talks about having an environment or climate for learning. But I actually think it's actually a climate of learnability. and there are lots of different types of learning. And like I said, I think the most important right now is self-regulated learning, and in particular, the number one thing that I think we need at UT, and that I think we need to be teaching our students, and we need to be teaching our children, and we need to be teaching ourselves, is to tolerate chaos and uncertainty, also known as ambiguity. Um, this is a very big challenge for people. Um, and it is going back to the narrative that we were talking about before. We are naturally able to tolerate ambiguity and uncertainty and the unknown as children. We just pick things up and figure them out. We walk down the street and stumble. We don't know where we're going, and we figure it out. But one of the reasons we're able to do that is that we have this sort of psychological safety around learning, and so that's something that's really important to build. To have a climate of learnability, there has to be psychological safety for learning. And again, I do believe that somehow along the lines in our lives that gets beaten out of us, and so it's hard to bring back to that. So that's the first thing, really making sure that there's a climate of learnability, but specifically around embracing ambiguity and being able to tolerate it. The second is system and processes, and this is probably the easiest place for people to start. Um, I've been doing this for over 10 years, but learnability language in every job description. So any job description that comes out of my desk always says that you must be able to teach yourself. It's a requirement. If you can't teach yourself, then it's going to be a difficult fit for you. And that's because I don't know everything, and I can't teach everybody everything, and there's so many new things happening all the time, and new innovations, new ways of doing things, rolling out, and people really need to be able to teach themselves and to teach me. I need people to teach me in order to be an effective leader. So having learnability in your job descriptions, and then creating organizational learning habits. So for example, on my team, every time we do a major initiative, we have lessons learned meeting or a post-mortem. It is a structure and it's a habit, and we never miss it.
Mhm.
And so I think that's important. So in climate of learnability, systems and process around learnability, and then leadership is that the third piece. And and I think one thing that is important to know is that leadership is not enough. Um, it's not enough. So you have to have these other components. But it's your job as the leader to have that sort of leadership presence to create the climate of learnability and the systems and process and an infrastructure of learnability for your team. And again, as a leader, make sure you hire for learnability. It's the number one quality to look for in talent right now.
Yeah. So that's a good segue, but I do want to just comment briefly on that first part that has to do with the sort of psychological safety aspect and the tolerance of ambiguity. I think one thing to be aware of too is that there are certain fields or sectors of work where that may be a harder adjustment to make than others. So if you're working in a warehouse or a physical plant, the culture might be that everything has to be ordered, and we're not going to tolerate ambiguity. But what I think is important to understand is that there can be order in the way you do things, but in terms of the learning process, you need to be okay with certain levels of tolerance for failure, and understanding that ambiguity is part of that learning process. But I think that culture of order and sort of strict engineering in the case of physical plant, that can't carry over to the learning process where there needs to be vulnerability.
Yeah, definitely. Vulnerability is one of the ways that we need to. It's one of the things that you can do to help people learn better. Um,
Right.
help them make mistakes, and there's so I kind of there's been this whole thing in school about how F is the new A. We need to help kids fail and let them fail, and I actually really disagree with the language of failure.
Yeah.
Because it's not okay for kids to fail, and it's not okay for staff to fail. And so I like to sort of own that. That it's just there are a lot of consequences to failure. A culture of experimentation and prototyping and learning and things learning from things being broken, a culture of mistakes, and learning how to own mistakes and address them, I think, is really important. But I sort of stay away from the failure is
It's
okay.
okay to fail.
Yeah.
Mhm. Okay, let's get into the leadership part of this. Now, leaders, as you mentioned a few times already, they have a critical role in establishing a learning organization. But can you talk more about that? What it looks like in practice?
Can you repeat that one?
Yeah. So did I break up? Sorry. That you've already talked about the role of leadership a little bit, but I want to get into a little bit more specifically. What does it look like in practice for leaders in a learning organization? How do they help promote that culture?
So definitely, I think making sure that having that, leading by example is really important. And one of the things that I think that when you're a leader, you have a lot of expertise, and so you have what we call in cognitive science expert blind spot. That's actually an expert blind spot is a symptom of mastery. Literally in your brain, when you become an expert, your brain clears out the stuff it doesn't need to know. So when you first learn something brand new that you've never learned before, so let's say you're learning a new theory or you're learning a new concept, a new management or leadership theory or new concept, you actually learn that in little pieces. You learn it in small components. They're not consolidated at all. But as you develop expertise, those small little pieces, they consolidate, and they become a conceptual framework that gets rid of all of the little things that you don't need to know. And that's what makes you more efficient and faster, and more expert. And so, but what that means is that when you're at that level of leadership and you have that expertise, you forget what it's like to not know those things, and
Right.
sometimes that expertise can have create a blind spot for you. So I think one of the things that is essential for leaders is to own their expert blind spots and do everything they can to learn everything they can outside their area of expertise. Become novices again, and I do teach a lot about design thinking, and we talk in design thinking about having a beginner's mindset,
Mhm.
going back to that innate place when we were children. But that can be really uncomfortable, especially for someone who's at a high level of leadership to become a novice again. But I think it's Dizzy Gillespie who said it's taken me my entire life to figure out what I don't know, and
Right.
I think that's what role leaders have is really, you know, um, being aware of their expertise and using their expertise to drive a vision forward, but also watching out for that expert blind spot.
Yeah. So that probably is one of the reasons why leaders are sometimes resistant to learning organizations or learning into development. What are some? It's something that we see with some level of frequency that leaders or managers are just resistant to learning and learning organizations. What are some other reasons why that might be?
So I think that that resistance actually is it should be the first cue to a leader that they're getting behind.
Mhm.
And I think that it's a resistance to actually it's a resistance to getting behind. So when you hear the phrases are very common, we've always done it this way. Let's keep doing it the way that we know how. When we're confronted with something new, we often say it's going to take too long. We don't have the time. It's too expensive. And these phrases are the death knells of
Yeah.
success. And so I think that it's often a symptom of something much deeper, and a symptom that things are going to go haywire,
Yeah.
and that you're falling behind. Um, and so aspiration is low. When you know innately that you're falling behind, aspiration is low. Your aspirations can suffer. And so one way to actually address that is to learn to focus on the positive. It's going to take too long. We don't have enough time. We just need people to do their widgets, right? Reframe that to focus on what's going to happen. What happens if we don't learn? What happens if this organization doesn't learn and doesn't evolve? And you can look at cases of organizations that failed to learn quickly and didn't evolve. Example, Blockbuster, those kinds of organizations that just sort of went with the we don't have time, it's going to take too long, and then they don't pivot.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Right.
Yeah, Kodak is another one. So how can leaders foster learning with their teams and feed their development? I'm going to wrap that same one up with,
Sure.
in particular, if a leader or a manager has hungry learners,
Mhm.
how to foster that or how to deal with it.
So yeah, so one is uh, to I think one thing that's really important is that to recognize as a leader, and this is also something it's something that many leaders don't do, is to see your team as your greatest textbook. The greatest theorists and the greatest textbook on your business are going to be your team and the people that you serve, not you. And really seeing your team, the people who are most native to the topic and who are deepest into the topic or the content or the subject or whatever you're doing
Who are doing the work.
doing the work are the ones that are going to come up with the innovations and who are going to be the greatest teachers. You're not the greatest teacher as the leader. And that can be very uncomfortable for some people. I think that's also a reason why people don't like learning organizations, is because they believe that they're the greatest teacher. It's actually the people you serve and the people who work with you that are your greatest teachers. And so one of the things that you can do is constantly be learning from your people, constantly see your people as those that can teach you, and your greatest textbook. I think is important, and then also think make learning a non-negotiable. It's a habit. It's a habit, into routine. And if you have a staff member who just doesn't really want to learn, doesn't want to learn new things, it isn't compelled to learn new things, doesn't feel that they have the time or has resistance, um, be empathic and remember that people have had this innate desire to learn, this wiring to learn beaten out of them, and try to help them get back to that beginner's mindset place, um, and identify where it is they might need the most coaching. Is it aspiration is low? Is it that this person doesn't have enough self-awareness? That's oftentimes the case. When we're working with staff, they don't have they need help with
Yeah.
self-awareness. The third one is curiosity, and the final one is a culture where you can have this experimentation and this prototyping environment. Which of those four does the staff member need boosting in? I'll say those again: aspiration, self-awareness, curiosity, and the ability to make mistakes.
It's great. So, let's get in. I have one more question before we get into our standard close, and it's a big one. At the highest level of UT, so we're talking about the C-suite.
Yep.
What advice do you have for those folks to help foster UT as a learning organization?
First is just understand that good leadership is not enough, and that it's not that learnability doesn't come from the C-suite. Learnability comes from a groundswell of an organization, that where learning is a habit, and it's not. We at UT, learning is a habit because it's the core of our business,
Right.
but that also needs to be in our administrative offices. So, understanding that good leadership is not enough. I think that they need to assess. I think we need, as leaders, to assess the learnability of the people that work with us, around those three building blocks: environment, process, and leadership, and find ways to make self-directed learning a requirement, an absolute habit.
Hmm. Okay, great. Uh, three more questions to go. First, what are you currently reading?
So I'm reading the Power of Habits by Charles Duhigg, and I love it. It's an awesome book. Highly recommend
It's
it.
fun. It's a fun one. Yeah, good. What was the hardest thing you had to do as a leader?
So the hardest thing I had to do as a leader was to leave Texas On Ramps, which was an organization I led for 5 years here at UT Austin, and I left at a time where it was very successful. We were doing amazing things. I loved my team. I loved the person I worked for. I loved everything about what I was doing. But it was time to take on a new task and learn something brand new. So as I said, learning is painful and learning
Right.
and that was the hardest thing I had to do as a leader was leave a leadership role that I really relished.
Yeah. Yeah, that's good. Give me two key pieces of leadership advice.
Hire for learnability and learn how to deal with ambiguity gracefully and agilely.
Excellent. Now, I just want to leave with one quick plug. Julie has developed, is in the process of developing a new course on learning. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So I'm really wanting to share with folks these tips and tricks for learning how to learn effectively. And in this little course, I just talk about how when we're trying to learn something, one of the best things that you can do is to try to pull information from your memory when you are learning something new rather than just read it over and over again. So most people, when they try to learn something, let's say you're learning a new management principle, let's say that you are reading a book on this new learning management principle, like I'm reading The Power of Habits. The
Mhm.
tendency is to take notes, read it again, read over your notes, read it more and more. And the best thing you can actually do, and what I did this morning after reading my chapter, The Power of Habits, is to actually sit for 5 minutes and try to recall what I read.
Mhm. Retrieval practice.
Real
Yeah.
practice. So
Mhm.
that act of doing that triples your chances that you'll remember it for the long term and that you'll be able to use it in the future. And so that's one of the things that I talk about in this short.
I'm really excited to see it. We, of course, when you're ready, we will promote it to staff. So those of you who are watching, be sure to follow us on Twitter. We have a LinkedIn group. We have a YouTube channel. It's all can be found through our website. We'll put the link on the feed of Facebook. And also, if you've been asking questions or comments through the Facebook feed, Julie will be able to respond to those after the interview. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. This was an amazing interview. I wish we had several more hours to talk to you, Julie, but I know that we'll be in touch in the coming days. Julie, Schell, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Hook 'em horns and keep learning.